The air was thick with excitement, the kind of electric energy that only a graduation day could bring. Linda stood at the entrance of the packed hall, her hands trembling slightly as she gripped the program in her hands. The sounds of laughter, chatter, and the hum of camera shutters echoed around her, but it felt like the world had slowed down for a moment. Her heart pounded in her chest, a familiar ache settling deep within. This day, this long-awaited milestone, should have been filled with pure joy. Her son, Daniel, was graduating, the culmination of years of hard work, determination, and sacrifice. Yet, for Linda, there was always an unspoken absence. Mark, her late husband, the man who had once stood beside her through every triumph and every trial, was not here. It was a day that should have been shared with him, a day that should have been filled with his pride and laughter. As Linda made her way into the hall, a flood of memories overwhelmed her. The past few years had been a blur of emotions, a mix of sorrow, resilience, and the kind of quiet grief that only someone who has lost a part of themselves can understand. She had poured every ounce of her love and strength into raising Daniel after Mark's sudden passing. She had done her best, and today, as Daniel walked across that stage, she would witness the results of all the sacrifices she had made for him. But as proud as she was, there was always that void, always the absence of Mark. He should have been here, right beside her, smiling and clapping as Daniel received his diploma. Linda finally found her seat among the other families. The moment she sat down, she took a deep breath, trying to steady the emotions that threatened to overwhelm her. She glanced around, watching the families and friends eagerly awaiting the ceremony to begin. She could feel the warmth of the crowd, the shared joy of watching a loved one reach a major milestone. But all Linda could feel was the heaviness of missing Mark. She closed her eyes for a moment, remembering how, just a few years ago, he had been there beside her for their son's high school graduation. The thought of him made her chest tighten. How different it all felt without him. She whispered under her breath, "You would have been so proud, Mark." And then, as the soft murmur of the crowd continued around her, it happened. Her eyes drifted toward the front of the hall, where the stage was set. But then something caught her attention, a movement in the crowd. A man, standing just a few rows ahead, had turned slightly, and for a fleeting second, Linda's breath caught in her throat. Her heart skipped a beat. She stared at him, her gaze locked onto his face. It couldn't be. It couldn't possibly be. But there was no denying it. He looked exactly like Mark, her husband, the man she had loved for so many years. He stood there, so strikingly similar in appearance, his posture, his features, his unmistakable smile. It was as though time had frozen, and Linda couldn't tear her eyes away. Her mind raced, trying to make sense of what she was seeing. Was she imagining it? Was her grief playing tricks on her again? She blinked, rubbed her eyes, and looked again. The man was still there, still standing in the crowd, so eerily familiar. Linda's heart began to pound in her chest, the thud of it loud in her ears. She felt the room closing in on her. This couldn't be real, could it? She looked around, desperate for some kind of explanation, but the faces around her were oblivious, caught up in their own celebrations. And yet, there he was, standing out like a beacon in a sea of strangers. It was like a punch to the gut. The resemblance was undeniable. It couldn't be a coincidence. But Linda's mind couldn't process it. She felt a cold sweat form on the back of her neck. She couldn't breathe. Her hand shook as she clutched the edge of her seat, and she stared, wide-eyed, at the man in front of her. Was it possible? Could it really be Mark? No, that didn't make sense. Mark had been gone for years. She had mourned him, buried him. She had done the hard work of rebuilding her life without him. So how could this man, who looked exactly like him, be standing there? Was it a trick of her mind, a cruel twist of grief playing on her fragile heart? Or was there something more to it? Was she seeing a ghost? A hallucination? The questions swirled in her mind, dizzying and overwhelming. She couldn't focus. Her thoughts tangled together, and she felt like she was sinking. The emotions she had carefully kept buried began to rise to the surface. There was a lump in her throat, and she felt tears threatening to spill. She had worked so hard to stay strong for Daniel, but in that moment, she didn't know if she could hold it together. And yet, she couldn't tear her eyes away. Every instinct inside her screamed that she had to know, had to understand, had to figure out who this man was. Because he wasn't just a stranger. He was someone who carried Mark's face, Mark's presence, and that feeling, that undeniable feeling that something in the world was out of place, yet somehow right at the same time. Linda's gaze never wavered from the man as the ceremony began. The world around her seemed to blur, and all that existed was the figure standing in front of her. He turned again, and for a brief second, their eyes met. And in that moment, Linda felt a chill run through her, but it wasn't from fear. It was something else, something she couldn't explain, but it felt like a whisper from the past. The truth, whatever it was just beyond reach, and Linda was about to find out just how far she would go to uncover it. Everything she thought she knew about love, loss, and the very nature of family was about to be shaken to its core. Linda sat quietly in the graduation hall, the noise of the ceremony fading into a distant hum. It had been years since Mark's passing, yet the pain still clung to her like a second skin. She had gotten used to it, the weight of his absence, but it never truly went away. Grief had become a constant companion in her life, a shadow that followed her wherever she went. Every day, she lived with the ache of what could have been. The plans, the dreams, the shared moments of joy that would never come to pass. But there was one thing that had always kept her going. One thing that had given her the strength to move forward despite everything. Her son, Daniel. Raising Daniel alone had been the hardest thing she'd ever done, but it had also been the most rewarding. When Mark died unexpectedly, it felt like the world had tilted off its axis. Their family had been a unit, strong, loving, and solid. But after Mark's passing, Linda's life was thrown into chaos. Suddenly, she was the sole parent, the one who had to pick up the pieces of their shattered family. There were nights when the weight of it all felt unbearable, when the loneliness and the exhaustion seemed to swallow her whole. She worked 2 jobs to keep a roof over their heads, sacrificed her own dreams to give Daniel the future she'd promised him and Mark. It wasn't easy. There were times when the bills piled up, when she had to choose between feeding herself or feeding Daniel. But Linda never complained. She had learned long ago that life didn't wait for you to catch your breath, and she couldn't afford to fall behind. She had to be strong, for Daniel, for their future, and for the memory of Mark. Every milestone Daniel reached was a small victory, a reminder of what they had overcome. And today, as she sat in that crowded hall, watching her son prepare to walk across the stage and accept his diploma, Linda was overwhelmed with pride. Daniel had always been an exceptional child. Even as a young boy, he'd shown a quiet determination and an intellectual curiosity that made Linda proud. He never sought attention, never needed to be the center of the spotlight. He was humble, hardworking, and kind, qualities that Linda had tried to instill in him after Mark's death. He was her rock, her constant reminder that despite the darkness, there was light. And now, as she watched him stand tall among his peers, ready to step into the world as a graduate, Linda could hardly believe how far they had come. Yet, as much as she wanted to rejoice in his success, there was a lingering sadness, a void that she couldn't escape. It was impossible not to feel the weight of Mark's absence in this moment. He should have been here, beside her, smiling with pride as Daniel walked across that stage. It was the kind of moment Mark had dreamed of, seeing their son graduate and start a new chapter of his life. Linda's heart ached at the thought of him not being there. She glanced over at Daniel, who was standing near the stage, chatting with his friends, his face lit up with a bright, excited smile. He looked so much like Mark in that moment, so full of life, so eager for the future. Linda's heart swelled with pride, but it was bittersweet. She could almost hear Mark's voice in her head, teasing Daniel about how he'd never let him out of the house without a hug and a lecture. She could imagine Mark's laughter ringing through the house as they celebrated this day, their son's triumph, just as they had celebrated his first steps, his first day of school, his high school graduation. But now, it was just her, just Linda, standing alone in the crowd, watching her son reach the peak of this monumental moment. Tears welled up in Linda's eyes as she fought to keep them at bay. She had promised herself she wouldn't cry today. This was Daniel's day, not a time for sadness or loss. She wiped her eyes quickly, hoping no one would notice. She had to be strong, not just for herself, but for Daniel. He had worked so hard for this moment, and she wasn't about to let her grief overshadow his accomplishments. But even as she reminded herself of that, the pain of missing Mark was almost unbearable. The quiet ache of his absence had always been there, lurking just beneath the surface, but today it felt sharper, more intense. How would she ever explain to Daniel the depth of what she was feeling? How could she put into words the profound sense of loss that seemed to suffocate her, even as she beamed with pride for her son? Linda's thoughts drifted back to the early days after Mark's death, when everything had seemed so uncertain. She had been afraid of what would happen to her, to Daniel, to their family. But over time, Linda had learned to be resilient. She learned to navigate the challenges that came with single motherhood, to find strength in the small victories, the everyday moments that made it all worth it. Daniel's success had been her guiding light, the one thing that kept her going through the darkest times. Every late night, every sacrifice, every tear had led to this day. She had done it for him, for their future. Now, as she watched Daniel laugh with his friends, she felt an overwhelming sense of gratitude. Despite everything, despite the years of struggle, they had made it. They had survived. And today, Daniel was standing on the cusp of something amazing. He was about to embark on his own journey, one that would take him places she could never have imagined. But Linda knew that whatever he did, wherever life took him, she would always be there for him, just as she had been since the day Mark was no longer there to protect him. Her thoughts were interrupted by a loud cheer that echoed through the hall, signaling the beginning of the ceremony. The graduates began to file in, their faces filled with anticipation and excitement. Linda stood up slowly, her eyes scanning the crowd for Daniel. She finally spotted him near the front of the stage, chatting with a few friends. Her heart swelled with pride, and for a brief moment, the ache in her chest softened. This was his moment. This was their moment. And no matter what, she would always carry the memory of Mark with her, in her heart, as a reminder of how far they had come together as a family. Linda wiped away the final tear that had fallen and stood tall. Today was about Daniel. Today, they would celebrate his success, his future, and the promise of all the good things that were still to come. The morning of Daniel's graduation was a day Linda had both eagerly anticipated and dreaded in equal measure. She had spent weeks preparing for this moment, the culmination of her son's hard work, the crowning achievement of his school years. It should have been a day filled with nothing but joy, but for Linda, it was laced with the bittersweet sting of loss. Every step she took in getting ready felt weighted, as if the world had conspired to remind her of what was missing. The rush of excitement and pride for Daniel was tempered by the hollow ache that came from Mark's absence. Linda stood in front of her mirror, adjusting the sleeves of her dress, her hands trembling ever so slightly as she buttoned the last button. The fabric felt foreign against her skin, not because it was new, but because it was part of a life she had learned to live without Mark. She had worn this dress once before, at another important event, but the last time, Mark had been beside her, his reassuring presence grounding her in the chaos of life. Today, there was only her reflection in the mirror, her own company as she prepared to celebrate the momentous day. Her eyes lingered on her reflection, not because she admired her appearance, but because it gave her a moment to pause, to gather herself. She smoothed her hair back, something she hadn't done in a long time. It was a habit Mark had always admired, a small act that made her feel put together. She couldn't help but think how much he would have loved to see Daniel today, how he would have been so proud of their son. She glanced over at the small frame on the dresser. It held a photograph of Mark, his smiling face frozen in time. Linda's heart ached as she walked over and ran her fingers gently over the glass. She whispered softly to herself, as though she were speaking to him directly. "I wish you could be here today, Mark. Daniel did it. He's graduating." Her voice trembled as she spoke, the weight of the words sinking deep within her chest. It was a quiet grief, the kind that never truly went away but only grew stronger with the passing of each milestone. She missed him every day, but today, it felt as though the absence was more pronounced. How would Mark have reacted? Would he have given Daniel a hug and made some goofy joke to ease the nerves? Would he have stood proudly beside her, his arm around her shoulder, as they looked on with tears in their eyes, knowing their son was about to step into the world as an adult? Linda closed her eyes for a moment, the ache in her heart becoming almost too much to bear. She longed for the comfort of Mark's voice, the reassurance he always gave her that everything would be okay. But today, she had to be strong, for herself, for Daniel. He needed her to be strong, to be the mother who could carry the weight of the day with grace, even if the burden felt too heavy. She took a deep breath, steadied herself, and straightened her dress. The time had come. Daniel would need her. There was no more time for dwelling in the past. As she walked downstairs to the front door, she caught a glimpse of herself in the hallway mirror, a fleeting moment that reminded her of how far she had come. Raising Daniel alone had not been easy, but today, she felt a sense of accomplishment. Despite the struggles, despite the heartache, they had made it to this day. Daniel had made it, and that was the most important thing. The car ride to the graduation ceremony was quiet. Linda drove with a steady hand, her eyes focused on the road ahead, but her mind wandered. She couldn't help but picture Mark beside her, imagining what he would say if he were there. She wondered what he would think of Daniel's success. Mark had always been the optimist, the one who believed that with hard work, anything was possible. He had instilled that belief in Daniel, and now, as Linda drove, she couldn't help but feel grateful for the foundation Mark had built for their son. It had shaped Daniel into the young man who stood before her today, confident, capable, and ready to take on the world. But the sadness still lingered, the shadow of Mark's absence clouding the moment. The joy of Daniel's achievement couldn't erase the longing for the man she loved, the man who should have been there beside her. When they arrived at the graduation hall, the sight of the bustling crowd did little to calm Linda's nerves. She could hear the chatter, the excitement in the air, the click of cameras, and the clinking of glasses as families gathered to celebrate. But as she stepped out of the car and walked toward the entrance, it felt as though she were stepping into another world. The noise, the laughter, the joy, it all seemed so distant, as if she were separated from it by an invisible barrier. The reality of Mark's absence seemed to intensify in this moment. She entered the hall, taking a deep breath as she surveyed the sea of people. Families were hugging, students were proudly walking around in their caps and gowns, and everywhere she looked, there was a celebration of success. But Linda's eyes were searching for Daniel. She found him easily among the sea of students, his tall frame, his confident posture. Her heart swelled with pride at the sight of him, but it was still hard to escape the gnawing sadness that threatened to pull her down. As she made her way to her seat, she tried to steady herself. She smiled at the people she passed, exchanged pleasantries with a few other mothers, but the whole time, she felt like she was living in a different reality. The joy in the room felt overwhelming, almost too much for her to absorb. It should have been easier, this feeling of celebration, but Mark's absence made everything feel muted. The noise, the laughter, the energy, it all seemed to fade into the background as she found her seat, her eyes still searching for her son. She sat down, adjusting her dress and trying to compose herself, but the hollow feeling inside her remained. She glanced around, hoping to see some sign of Mark, some reminder of the family they once were. But there was nothing. No familiar voice to whisper in her ear, no reassuring touch on her shoulder. Just the crowd, the noise, and the silence in her heart. Linda took another deep breath and watched as the ceremony began. Her son was about to walk across that stage, and she couldn't help but smile, even through the tears that threatened to fall. This was Daniel's day. This was the moment he had worked for, and nothing could take that away from her. No matter how much she missed Mark, today was about their son. She wiped away a tear before it could fall, her heart full of pride, but also a quiet sadness she would carry with her always. Today, she was both a mother and a widow, and as she watched Daniel take the next step into his future, she couldn't help but wonder if Mark was somehow watching too. Linda had just settled into her seat, her hands resting on her lap as she tried to calm her racing thoughts. The noise of the graduation hall filled the air. Laughter, chattering, and camera flashes from proud parents, all blending together in a blur of celebration. She glanced down at her phone, quickly scanning through the messages of congratulations from family and friends. There was so much to be thankful for today. Her son's graduation, his bright future ahead, but all Linda could feel was an aching emptiness in the pit of her stomach. Without Mark here, the moment felt hollow, like something was missing. She glanced up, letting her eyes wander through the crowd. In the sea of faces, she didn't expect to find anything that would catch her attention, but something did. There, in the distance, near the far edge of the hall, stood a man. For a brief second, Linda froze, her breath catching in her throat. Her heart skipped a beat as she locked eyes with him, the world around her blurring out of focus. Her gaze fixed on him as if the sight alone could make everything make sense. He looked so familiar. At first, she dismissed the thought. It couldn't be. She shook her head slightly, her heart pounding as she focused again on the ceremony. It had to be her imagination playing tricks on her. She must have been tired, or the lighting in the hall had created an illusion. But when she glanced back, there he was again, standing in the same place, looking exactly like Mark. Mark, her late husband. Her heart began to race, and her breath became shallow. She couldn't tear her eyes away from him. It wasn't just his face, though the resemblance was uncanny. It was the way he stood, the familiar posture, the way his eyes seemed to glisten with a knowing warmth. That smile, too. It was unmistakable. It was his smile, the one he had worn so many times when he was still alive. Linda's stomach twisted with confusion. She blinked rapidly, convinced that the shock of the day had created some kind of hallucination. But as she squinted, his face remained just as clear. The same eyes, the same expression, the same presence. It had to be him. Her mind went into overdrive. She turned her head away, blinking hard, willing herself to focus on the event before her. This is ridiculous, she thought. It's just a coincidence. Maybe he has a twin. But even as the words ran through her mind, she knew they weren't comforting. The man she was staring at was not a twin. This was Mark. She could feel it in her bones. Her heart thundered in her chest, a drumbeat of panic and disbelief. She shook her head slowly, her eyes darting back and forth between the stage and the man in the crowd. She couldn't tear herself away. It was as if something magnetic was pulling her attention to him. The light in the hall shifted slightly, and for a brief moment, he was obscured by the people around him, but not for long. As if sensing her gaze, he turned slightly, and their eyes locked again. Linda's breath caught in her throat, and she felt an electric charge pulse through her. The world around her seemed to stop. There was no mistaking it. It was him. The overwhelming flood of emotion that surged through her felt like a tidal wave. Her heart swelled with joy and agony at the same time. She could feel her palms beginning to sweat, her mind spinning with impossible questions. How could this be? It had been 3 years since Mark had passed away. 3 years of grieving, of facing life alone, of raising Daniel without him. And yet, here he was, standing there, alive. Or was he? Was this a cruel trick of her mind? Had grief finally driven her mad? Linda's eyes darted back and forth between Mark, if that was even his name now, and the people surrounding her. She scanned the crowd frantically, but no one else seemed to have noticed. They were all too absorbed in their own moments of celebration. No one else saw the man who looked so much like her husband. Am I losing my mind? She thought, her head spinning. Could it be possible? Could Mark have faked his death? Or was this something even stranger, more inexplicable? Had she conjured him up from the depths of her grief? Linda's hands trembled as she clutched the edge of her seat, unable to look away. Every logical part of her brain told her that this wasn't possible, that this wasn't real. But her heart, her soul, was telling her something different. She knew that man. The way he stood there, still and calm among the chaos of the graduation hall, exuded a presence she had missed every single day for the past 3 years. Suddenly, Linda's thoughts shifted. She turned to her son, Daniel, standing near the stage, preparing to take his diploma. He had worked so hard for this moment. This was his day, not hers. He deserved her full attention. But the pull to look back at the man in the crowd was too strong. She caught another glimpse of him, and he smiled again. This time, that same smile that she had missed so much, the one that used to make her heart ache with love. It was as though the entire world around them had faded, and there was only that smile. The smile that meant home. Her thoughts scrambled in confusion. She tried to focus on the ceremony, to remind herself that this was about Daniel, not about the impossible situation unfolding in her mind. But no matter how hard she tried, she couldn't tear herself away. The man in the crowd, Mark, was still there, and her pulse quickened with every glance. Was this real? Was this her husband? Or was it just the culmination of years of grief, manifesting in some unexplainable way? Linda closed her eyes for a moment, trying to steady her breathing. She needed answers. But the only truth she felt in that moment was the undeniable certainty that the love of her life was standing right before her, alive, or at least, in some form she couldn't yet comprehend. Her heart ached with the need to understand, to know if this was real, if she was still clinging to a fantasy she had created in the depths of her grief. And then, she waited. She waited to see what would happen next. The room around Linda seemed to blur as the emotions surged inside her. Her heart raced, and her mind refused to make sense of the impossible scene unfolding in front of her. She had been staring at the man in the crowd, certain that he looked exactly like Mark, her late husband. The more she tried to dismiss the thought, the more real it became. Was it truly him? No, it couldn't be. Mark was gone. She had buried him 2 years ago, and there was no way this man, standing just a few rows away, could be him. But there he was, his posture, his eyes, his smile. Everything about him screamed familiarity, and yet, something felt off. The connection, the recognition, was there, but so much more was missing. As Linda's internal turmoil churned, the figure of the man in the crowd seemed to grow closer, almost as though he was drawn to her. Her thoughts were clouded with confusion and disbelief. Could she be hallucinating? Or was this just some cruel trick her grief had conjured up to torment her? She had already endured so much. Losing Mark, raising Daniel alone, and battling through every quiet ache that echoed from her heart. Now, seeing someone who looked exactly like him, it felt like a dream that was just about to break, one that would shatter the careful world she had built around herself to cope with her loss. And then, before she could process any of it, he was standing in front of her. David's approach was calm, almost hesitant, as if he could sense the whirlwind of emotions tearing through her. He smiled gently, his expression laced with both understanding and an unspoken apology for the shock he had caused. As he reached out to her, Linda felt a strange combination of shock, suspicion, and curiosity flood through her. Her breath hitched, and she could barely keep herself steady as her gaze locked onto his face. He was the spitting image of Mark. There was no denying it now. His features were so identical, so precise, that for a moment, Linda thought she might actually be losing her grip on reality. "Hi, Linda," the man said softly, his voice a familiar warmth that she thought she had long forgotten. "I'm David. I'm Mark's twin brother." Linda blinked, the words crashing into her mind like a tidal wave. She stumbled back in her seat, her pulse thudding loudly in her ears as she tried to process what he was saying. Mark had a twin? How could she have not known this? They had been married for nearly a decade, and yet there had been no mention of a brother. No sign that someone else shared his face, his life, his essence. Why hadn't he ever told her? And why was he here now? David paused, seeming to understand her shock, before continuing. "I know this must be a lot to take in. Mark and I, we weren't close for a while. He didn't want to complicate your grief after he passed. He thought you had enough to carry with Daniel's future and the loss of him." His voice cracked with emotion as he spoke his brother's name. "But I'm here now. I'm sorry I didn't reach out sooner." Linda's mind swirled with questions. Why didn't Mark tell me about you? Why would he keep something like this from me? Why didn't he trust me enough to know the truth? The words tumbled out, but they were tangled with both anger and sadness. She felt betrayed. her sense of loss deepening as she wondered if there had been parts of her husband's life she never fully understood. David's eyes softened, a hint of sorrow in his gaze. Mark didn't want to hurt you more than you already had been. After he passed, he didn't think it was the right time for you to learn about me. He loved you, Linda, and he always thought you deserved to have the space to grieve on your own terms. He didn't want to bring any more pain or confusion into your life. David paused, his hands trembling slightly as he continued. But when I saw Daniel was graduating today, I knew it was time. It's the first real milestone for him without Mark here, and I couldn't stay away any longer. I know how much Mark would have wanted his family to be whole, and maybe, just maybe, today is the right time for that. Linda sat in stunned silence, her hands clutching the arms of her chair for support. The weight of his words settled heavily in her chest. She had spent so long mourning Mark, clinging to his memory, afraid of letting go. And now, she was faced with the startling reality that someone else, someone who looked exactly like him, had been watching from the sidelines all along. How had she never known? David shifted uncomfortably, clearly sensing Linda's internal struggle. I know this must be overwhelming, he said gently, his voice full of empathy. I don't expect you to forgive me right away, or to trust me immediately. I just wanted you to know the truth. I'm here for Daniel, for you, whenever you're ready. Linda's heart felt like it was being pulled in two different directions. There was a part of her that wanted to run away from this revelation, to escape the emotions that were rising to the surface. But there was also a part of her that felt a deep longing, a yearning for connection that she hadn't even realized was missing. Mark was gone, but this man, this stranger who shared his face, his blood, was here now. He was part of the family that Mark had left behind, and in some strange way, that brought her a small amount of peace. Slowly, Linda rose to her feet. The room around her seemed to fall away, and for a moment, she and David were the only ones standing in the whirlwind of emotions. She didn't know what the future would hold, or if she could ever fully accept this truth. But for now, in this moment, there was a fragile sense of comfort in knowing that she wasn't alone. That Mark's legacy, his love, his family, had not disappeared with him. Thank you, Linda whispered, her voice hoarse with emotion. Thank you for being here. For Daniel. For me. David nodded, a tear slipping down his cheek as he reached out to gently take her hand. The reunion, so long in the making, was filled with more grief than either of them had anticipated. But there was also hope. Hope that through this unexpected twist of fate, Linda could find a way to rebuild the family she had lost. Linda, still reeling from the shock of meeting David, slowly finds herself drawn to the warmth and familiarity in his eyes. As they sit together, their conversation flows naturally, and Linda listens intently as David shares stories of Mark, his quirks, his humor, his love for his family. It's as though a part of Mark has been brought back to her, not in the form she expected, but in a way that allows Linda to feel a sense of healing. The grief that has haunted her for so long softens, replaced by a quiet but profound sense of closure. It's in David's gestures, his words, and even his smile that Linda finds a renewed connection to the love she thought was lost forever. As they continue to talk, David speaks with compassion and understanding. He expresses his regret for staying away for so long, but reassures Linda that Mark's decision was meant to protect her heart. Through the brotherly bond they now share, Linda feels a sense of peace she never imagined possible. She smiles softly, realizing that Mark's love was never really gone, just transformed. The moment of true healing arrives as Daniel, their son, steps into the ceremony's spotlight. Wearing his cap and gown, he exudes pride and accomplishment, ready to receive his diploma. But for Linda, this moment holds even deeper meaning. With David by her side, she feels Mark's presence more than ever, even if only in spirit. Her heart swells with pride as Daniel steps forward to receive his degree, the culmination of all the hard work he's put in and the dreams his father once held for him. David, standing beside Linda, reaches out to squeeze her hand. It's an unspoken connection, a promise that even though the family has changed, their love for each other remains steadfast. Linda watches her son, her eyes welling with tears, not of sorrow, but of gratitude. Her family has been through so much, and yet, in this moment, they are stronger than ever. As Daniel walks off the stage, Linda turns to David, her face shining with a bittersweet but hopeful smile. They both share a quiet moment, knowing that although life is full of unexpected turns, love endures in ways they never imagined. Mark may be gone, but his legacy, his love, and his spirit live on. Not just in memories, but in the family that remains, bound by their shared journey. If you've enjoyed this emotional and uplifting story, be sure to like, share, comment, and subscribe to our channel for more heartwarming tales. Your support means the world to us, and we can't wait to bring you more stories that touch the heart.